Ready. Nirmal sir, you're most welcome.
Two-day international conference on environmental imagination and greening of literary studies. On behalf of the department, I thank all the participants for your kind gesture in making this conference memorable and meaningful with your presence and participation. Prayer helps establish a purpose and seek wisdom at once. Prayer isn't a spare wheel that you pull out when in need, but it is the steering wheel that directs you in the right path throughout. So, as we begin, I now call upon Dr. Ronald David, Assistant Professor of English, to pray as we begin the day.
Let's all rise for prayer. Let's all pray. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this wonderful day that was blessed us with, Lord. As we are going to begin this conference, we seek your blessings and guidance throughout. We pray for our magnanimous management, administrators, organizing secretary, HODs, deans, and all the participants. Bless them, Lord. We also seek your guidance, especially grant us the strength, patience, and knowledge so that we could understand and reap the fruits of this conference, Lord. We also pray for the young minds who are gathered here. Help them to widen their knowledge so that they'll be instrument of change in the future. We ask the few words in the precious name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen.
Every sunrise is God saying, "Welcome home. There's always a place for you." I now call upon Dr. S. Shobana, Dean of Arts, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of English, Bishop Heber College, to welcome the gathering.
Greetings from the Department of English, Bishop Heber College, to all who've joined online, especially the renowned scholars and the speakers for the day, Dr. Scott Slovic and Dr. Nirmal Selvamani, and the participants who've joined online, and students and staff who are present here in the hall to be a part of the two-day conference on environmental imagination and greening of literary studies. Thank you, first of all, each and every one of you for being here with us today at the conference. We've all been eager to be a part of our association due to a mutual passion for environmental concerns and humanitarian responses. It's the context of bridging the conventional divide between the Western, Eastern, and indigenous ways of relating to the natural world, which looks for me the fulcrum of our deliberations. Literature and environment, the field as it is, resists the traditional divide between nature and culture, showing how many environmental issues have always been entangled in human questions of justice, labor, and politics. And so the purpose of the two-day exercise is to promote different learning initiatives through our planned lectures to be given by distinguished experts in their own respective fields, and special conferences, discussions where you'll be able to add your views freely. I hope these will help you, especially research students and PG students, to grow, to be more fecund and creative. I would like to welcome very specially the speakers of the day, Professor Scott Slovic. Welcome. The University Distinguished Professor of Environmental Humanities, University of Idaho, Moscow, Idaho, USA. A world-renowned environmental thinker, pioneer in eco-criticism, the first elected president of ASLAN. But for him, this conference would not have happened. And Dr. Shanti, the organizing secretary, will vouchsafe for it. A profuse thanks, Professor, for your references as speakers today and tomorrow. He is a multilingualist, conversant in French, Japanese, Hebrew, and more. A very interesting note about Professor, and a renowned scholar, world-renowned scholar in eco-criticism, literature, and environment. A very humble person at heart, very amiable, who at once said a yes to our invitation, and with a heart full of thanks from students and staff of the department and all the participants who have joined today online, I wholeheartedly extend a warm welcome to Professor Scott Slovic on behalf of the department and the college, the principal and the chairman of the governing board. May we welcome him by giving him an applause, a clap. With us, we have today Dr. Nirmal Selvamani. He is definitely no stranger. It's because we've had a long association with him from the time he was the professor at the Madras Christian College, Chennai, writer, eco-critic. He was also the Dean, Central University of Tamil Nadu, South India, at Tiruvarur, before he took up environmental studies and literature as his full-time occupation. And he is the pioneer of eco-critical studies, this part of the world, South India particularly. He introduced the course Eco-Criticism in the Indian universities, and with special focus on the regionalized eco-critical study called Thinai. And importantly, I extend profuse thanks because he's never said a no to any of our invitations. For over 30 years now, I remember. Hence, and we have drunk deep from the well of resource that he is on literature environment. And so maybe all students and staff welcome him by showing our appreciation now by clapping. Thank you, sir, for accepting to talk in the conference. And we, of course, we look forward to drawing from you new and newer insights on the topic. Warm welcome, sir. Tomorrow, we will have 3 speakers: Professor Franco Bezon, Emeritus Professor of Literature and English at the University Toulouse, Jean Jaurès, France. Her academic interests are ecology and literature, travel writing, landscape and writing, especially Native American and Canadian literature. We welcome her to tomorrow's sessions. Maybe she'll be able to join us online even today. Most welcome, ma'am. Tomorrow we will have Dr. Bennett joining us. Of course, at this juncture, I must very specially recognize his acceptance to be a part of this conference. He is an associate professor of English at the National College. Again, no stranger to the college because he's always been warm and ready to give his consent to any of our invitations. A professor of English at the National College, Trichy, an ardent teacher of English literature, and a zeal for research in literature studies is undeniable, and of course, indelible from those who have benefited from him as students. Both of staff and students have benefited amply out of his resources. Another friend to the department who, no exaggeration, has never said a no to any of our invitations. Thank you, sir. A warm welcome to Dr. Bennett, and he holds a session tomorrow. Dr. Joyce Onama Ogafer, hope I pronounced the name correctly. She is a senior lecturer, Department of English and Literary Studies, Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, Nigeria. Her research expertise include environmental literary studies, ecofeminism, gender studies, oral literature, post-colonial studies, and comparative literatures. Madam will be the speaker tomorrow. On behalf of staff and students and the participants of the conference and the chairpersons too, I welcome the speakers of tomorrow, and especially Madam from Nigeria. Very warm welcome to the colleagues, English fraternity from the colleges in and around Trichy, who have given their consent to chair sessions, paper presentation and discussion sessions. There are 2 of them who have come, who have given their consent from other places, such as Ranchi, North India, and another one, Shiv Nadar University, Chennai. Dr. Nivedita Bandobidhyay from Shiv Nadar University, Chennai. Dr. Swatileka Mahato, Sarla Birla University, Ranchi. Dr. Suganti Holy Cross College, Trichy. Dr. Lizzie Williams and Xavier's College of Arts and Science, Palayamgote. And Dr. Sandra Quintal from Holy Cross College, Trichy, have all given their ready consent to chair sessions and who will also contribute a lot to the paper presentations. Thank you very much, all of you who might have joined online today, for agreeing to our requests, last minute requests, many of them. We look forward to benefiting from your resource very much. On behalf of the students and staff of a department, I would like to, last but not least, extend my wholehearted thanks the principal of the college, Dr. Paul Dayabaran, and the bishop and chairman of the governing board of the college, Dr. Right Reverend Chandrasekharan, who've been a source of motivation and encouragement all along. They've been an unrelenting guidance and support, especially when we set out to conduct such academic exercises. On behalf of the college and the Department of English, I'm very pleased to welcome them in absentia, or they may have joined, or they will join online the conference, and thank them profusely for their support all through. The department thanks and welcomes those of you who have been with us for a long time as part of the organizing committee in the planning of this event, as well as those who have joined us today on Zoom to make a valuable contribution in the form of presenting your papers. Most welcome the chairpersons also. The paper presenters are as important as speakers, since each and every one of you will be giving your own inimitable, unique insight into a text from the point of view of greening literary studies or greening imagination. And so thanks very much for the wonderful way in which you've responded to our requests for paper. And so we've received 80 and odd papers in good number, and we are happy that the paper presenters responded in such a good number. Thank you so much. That is pretty much appreciated by the organizing committee and the department and the college. And we would like to honor you by giving you enough and more time for discussion after your presentation. Most welcome the paper presenters. Hearty welcome on behalf of staff and students. May we warm up at this time for the exercise, recalling the lines of the famous Chilean poet Nicaragua. The mistake we made was in thinking that the earth belonged to us, when the fact of the matter is we are the ones who belong to the earth. So with these words of the famous Chilean poet, I think we are oriented towards beginning the two-day intellectual exercise, and the speakers will make sure that doesn't stop with just intellectualization or thinking level, but even more than that, definitely, since this is environment, a social concern, and literary imagination. May we have a very fruitful time in the 2 days to come. A hearty welcome, one and all gathered here and joined online, on behalf of the staff and students of the Department of English, Bishop Heber College. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for those warm words of welcome. We'll be pondering over an issue as old as time for these 2 days. Steve Jobs opines thus: learn continually, there is always one more thing to learn. And I say, before acting on any recommendation, know the rationale. May I call forward Dr. K. Shanti, Assistant Professor of English, Associate Dean of Arts, and the Organizing Secretary of this International Conference, to present us the concept note.
Thank you, Aarti. Esteemed chief guests of this conference, Professor Scott Slovic, Dr. Nirmal Selvamani, Dr. Francois Bizon, Dr. Bennett, and Dr. Joyce, and respected Dr. Paul Dayabaran, Principal of Bishop Heber College in absentia, respected Professor Argapa Moses, Vice Principal, Aided Section in absentia, respected Dr. Shobana, Dean of Arts and Head of the PG and Research Department of English, respected Dr. Suresh Frederick, Dean of Research and Development, Head of UG Department of English, respected Dr. C. Dhanapal, Dean of Training and Placement and Coordinator of Shift 2 Department of English, ladies and gentlemen, faculty friends here and far and wide, research scholars, students online and on-site, and all who are part of the two-day virtual international conference on environmental imagination and greening of literary studies. I bring you my humble greetings. This conference on environmental imagination and greening of literary studies inaugurates an exciting new series of deliberations on environmental philosophy, imagination, crisis, ethics, literature, and writings, one of the enormous and complex areas to explore and draws attention towards more practical insights on today's environmental issues. This eco-conference calls for a fresh shift in the critical thinking on political and spiritual decision-making processes, on restructuring our ideological praxis, and to ruminate on the quality of life to be in the post-pandemic COVID-19 world. Inventive reflections on how this COVID-19 state has changed our way of thinking and the pattern of our life are a matter of interest from the eco-critical, eco-political, and eco-conscious perspectives. Hence, the deliberations are entitled to focus on the need for a modified understanding of our present environment and the ongoing crisis or reality which threaten human and the non-human world alike today. Environmental concerns have become ubiquitous when all the other spheres of human endeavors have gone green, namely architecture, religion, philosophy, technology, economy, industry, business, and management. And while many green movements with an array of agenda crusade to preserve the rights of the non-human, the literary academia is far trailing behind, not having taken its cudgels on the machine civilization and all those attitudes and actions of man which devastated the only living planet on the earth. Hence, this conference goads our literary academia to heed to the wake-up call and to draw more attention or action plans to make literary studies green and safeguard the integrity of the living planet in the best possible way. This conference calls for a political and spiritual decision-making process to get connected with nature, turning away from our machine civilization that stifle man and nature relationship, to cohabit with nature in harmony and to perceive our aggregate moral obligation looking forward, looking at the world past. I feel it imperative to bring to your mind a few concerns expressed by the pundits of eco-criticism, which are worth ruminating today in this intellectual forum. Glotfelty remarks that our society in general, our profession in particular, have faced three crises in the last 30 years, which are subjects of widespread social concern and world issues. Number one, civil rights. Number two, women's liberation. And number three, environmental degradation. We have deliberately and adequately discarded these, the last issue, environmental degradation, and we have never paid much attention on this. Glenn Love speculates that literary studies have remained indifferent to the environmental crisis. Literary criticism and theory has remained so peculiarly unaffected, curiously unwilling, unable to address such issues which are at the forefront of public concern. He mourns over our literary discipline's limited humanistic vision and a narrow anthropocentric view of life. He talks about our general failure to apply any sense to this awareness of our daily work. He says, we people of literature do not care enough. He urges that the time has come for the literary scholars to respond more actively to the environmental crisis by recovering the lost social role of literary criticism. He encourages and recognizes the primacy of nature and the necessity for new ethic and aesthetic embracing of the human and the natural, and the necessity for being in tune with the environment. This, he says, may provide us with the best hope of recovering the lost social role of literary criticism. He quotes Freud, who opines that millions of people share in the same neurosis. The means of curing the communal neurosis cannot come from those affected by neurosis. A sick rather cannot heal the sick. Rather, it must come from elsewhere. Here is where John Alcon finds this elsewhere is only in English literature. I bring to your mind Nash's powerful words. He says, we record a powerful influence on environmentalism in a number of ways in intellectual fields, which has resulted in greening of liberal thought, greening of religion, philosophy, and law. As we realize that the depressing spectacle we witness today are environmental problems, which are global in scale because the earth is one huge interconnected ecological system. The outcomes of the deliberations in this conference must take each individual forward to do what is right within one's own reach to safeguard our only living planet Earth and be effective at solving problems in our own communities. Nature has been always a part of literature down the ages past, yet a special attention to the study of landscapes, its ecology, and the role of nature in literary texts was not much focused until the theory like eco-criticism emerged. Since then, scholarly missions in theoretical and conceptual investigations have made ready anyone to investigate artistic texts from ecological and eco-critical perspectives. Though extensive research has been carried out in the past by many eco-critics in the West, yet a sizable few alone have taken up eco-criticism as a major field of research and discipline of study in the East, or a very few in India, like Dr. Nirmal Selvamani. A few literary artists and environmental activists in India, though have been so environmentally conscious, their voices have been either a cry in the wilderness or muffled due to the play of dominant power structures over the society. Hence, repeated and concerted efforts need to be taken by our literary academia to bring the eco-consciousness into being and becoming a system as a base for all human activity. In this light, the objectives of the conference will focus on our response to identify the lacuna or problems in man's approach to the environment from literary perspective, to provide measures that can be adhered to by the literary academia to promote eco-consciousness, to convince the literary academia, like the environmentalists and scientists, can bring through ecological praxis to the environmental issues the world is facing today, to bring an awareness of the many impending threats that are interconnected due to our misappropriation of the natural resources and annihilating nature in all its form in the name of progress. And also to bring an understanding of the paradoxical situation of how humankind eulogizes what should be handled with care and neglects to comprehend the realities of life at peril. To suggest serious decision-making on the eco-political context and revamp the present system of functioning, to emphasize a thorough restructuring of the society in which the need for technology would be based on ecologically sound principles, to accentuate the need for environmentalism to play a major role not only in economy and politics, but also in literature, where we will produce green literature, to heighten the fact that we not only talk and walk green, but also write green. With this note, I deem it a great privilege and joy to introduce the keynote speaker, Professor Scott Slovic, one of the seminal minds in environmental thinking, a doyen of eco-criticism, a much distinguished professor who is celebrated for his trailblazing and cutting-edge research works. In 1990, the University of Nevada, Reno, created the first academic position in literature and the environment. In 1992, at the annual meeting of the Western Literature Association, a new association for study of literature and environment was formed with Professor Scott Slovic as its elected first president. He is at present the University Distinguished Professor at the University of Idaho, Moscow, Idaho, the USA. His scholarship is concerned with the environmental implications of literary texts. He pursued his undergraduation at Stanford University, his post-graduation at Brown University, Rhode Island. He was selected to become a Fulbright scholar at the University of Bonn, Federal Republic of Germany, and he finished his PhD at Brown University, Providence in Rhode Island. He started his teaching career at Brown University in Rhode Island, and then he moved to Texas University, where he became the associate professor of English. And then he took up his teaching career in the University of Nevada, Reno, and he worked there for 17 years as a professor of literature and environment, director, co-writing program, chair, literature and environment graduate program committee, director, Center for Environmental Arts and Humanities. Scott Slovic joined the faculty at the University of Idaho in 2012 after teaching for 17 years at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he helped to create the prominent graduate program in literature and environment and develop the Center for Environmental Arts and Humanities. At the University of Idaho, Moscow, USA, he holds important positions till today as the University Distinguished Professor of Literature and Environment, Professor of Natural Resources and Society, participating faculty, the Environmental Science Program, faculty fellow, Office of Research and Economic Development, initiatives for cross-disciplinary, international and public impact research, and editor-in-chief, ISLE, chair, Department of English. He has visiting appointments with many universities across the world, spanning from Brazil and Malaysia, and 2 universities in Turkey, 5 universities in People's Republic of China, Spain, Malaysia, Indian Institute of Technology, Chennai, 3 universities in Taiwan, 2 in France and in South Korea, as well as in University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia. He is also the visiting professor in a few universities in Japan. He has, to his credit, 7 monographs and many edited and co-edited textbooks. His editorial positions and edited journal issues amounts to 27 in number. He is the advisory member for more than 15 editorial boards. He has published more than 300 articles, given more interviews, created open educational resources and reviews, and is the author and editor and co-editor of 27 books, including Going Away to Think, Engagement, Retreat, and Eco-Critical Responsibility, and the textbook on literature and the environment. So he has a lot of recent books to his credit. They're very significant. For the lack of time, running through his 140-page CV, I'm not able to do adequate justice to list out all his credentials here, but a very few significant things let me quote so that you will know Professor Scott Slovic. And he serves as an advisor and contributor to the Arithmetic Compassion. And Professor Scott served as a founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment. He edited the journal of ISLE. He edited the Environmental Arts and Humanities book series. He also serves on the editorial boards for 16 scholarly journals and 2 presses. Previously, he has been the Fulbright National Screening Committee member for the Institute of the International Education, a panelist in American Studies and American Literature for the National Endowment of Humanities. He has been a Fulbright scholar in Germany, Japan, China, and many other countries. In December 2019, he was appointed as a Fulbright specialist to visit Cappadocia University's Environmental Humanities Center in Turkey. In addition to his position as University Distinguished Professor of Environmental Humanities in the Department of English, Idaho, Scott has an affiliate appointment in the Department of Natural Resources and Society. He has also served as a faculty fellow in the Office of Research and Economic Development since 2017, responsible for special initiatives in cross-cultural, disciplinary, international, and public impact research. In this capacity, he co-authored the Public Impact Research Report for the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities in 2019. He continues to be a member of the Interim Leadership Council for the HIBAR, Highly Integrative Basic and Responsive Research Alliance. He has helped to develop the University of Idaho's Semester in Wild program in 2013 and regularly teaches the environmental writing courses in the annual fall semester program, which takes place at the Taylor Wilderness Research Center in Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in central Idaho. Professor Scott Slovic teaches courses in interdisciplinary and environmental humanities, American and comparative literature, environmental writing, and nonfiction writing. He has numerous awards and honors. So let me quote a little few to your knowledge. He is the University Distinguished Professor, and he's been awarded that, the University of Idaho in 2020. So Excellence in Research and Creative Activity, University of Idaho in April 2018. Excellence in Interdisciplinary Collaborative Efforts Award in Idaho in 2014. Thornton Peace Prize, University of Nevada, Reno in May 2012. Is the Vice Chair, Board of Directors, Orion Magazine, 2010 to 15. Chair, Selection Committee, Inaugural Orion Book Award in 2007. He has received Regents Award for Graduate Academic Advising, Nevada State System of Higher Education in May 2006. Nevada Humanities Award in 2004. And he has many professional leadership and advisory positions and special affiliations. And he is holding many responsibilities, till today. And he is a writer in residence, Andrews Experimental Forest, Oregon State University, and the U.S. Forest Service, Blue River. And he has many external program reviews and consultations, which runs to many pages. And in his university, he holds very important leadership positions. He's the chair, Department of English, University of Idaho till 18. He was the chair, Executive Committee, Department of English, University of Idaho till 18. There's a chair, Tenure Recommending Committee, Department of English, Idaho till 18. And chair, Research Committee, and University of in Idaho, chair, Research Committee in the Department of English. And he is associated with the Wanton School of Business. He received University Award for Excellence in Research and Creative Activity, and is honorary member of the French Society for the Study of Travel Writing in English. Apart from that, as Dr. Shobana introduced him, he is a multilingualist. He is well-versed in German, French, Spanish, Chinese, Hebrew, and Japanese. So we have such an eminent person today with us. We welcome you, sir, to the conference, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Dr. Shanti. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that elaborate and detailed introduction. That's very generous of you, and it sounds as if you studied my CV quite carefully. So thank you for all of that attention, and congratulations to Bishop Haber College for organizing this conference. It's a lot of work to put together a conference that is simultaneously in person and virtual. So thank you for all of that work, and I wish I could attend more of it, but it's already quite late at night where I am. It's 10 o'clock, after 10 o'clock in the evening here in the state of Oregon in the American West. And I've had a fairly long day already. In fact, earlier this evening, I gave the 8th and final lecture in a lecture series at a Chinese university. So thanks to the wonders of Zoom, I was able to sit in the state of Oregon in the United States and lecture in China a few hours ago, and now to join you in southern India. So I think Zoom is quite amazing, but it also, we haven't solved the time zone problem. So it's soon going to be very late at night here, but I'm sure the conversation at your conference will go on and be very interesting. So I actually have some slides to show, and I hope I'm able to share my screen. So I'm going to try to do that. Looks like I am able. So just a moment. Let me find my slideshow. Okay, here it is. I'm going to reduce this. Okay, yeah, so I'd like to, I'm keeping an eye on the clock and would like to stay within my time and give you a brief presentation about some of my current research. During the many years that I've been doing eco-criticism and interdisciplinary environmental humanities research, I've done a lot of different types of studies. Some of them, as Dr. Shobana was explaining earlier, some of my earlier work was analyzing specific literary texts from an environmental point of view. And I don't do so much of that anymore. I've also done a lot of historical summaries and analyses of the tradition of eco-criticism, the historical development of the field in the United States and internationally. So I'm very well aware of Professor Nirmal Selvarmani's work on Tene and very traditional approaches in countries like India, particularly Tamil Nadu, but also approaches in Australia and Japan and China and various regions of Europe and other parts of the world, Africa, Latin America. So I've done a variety of different approaches, but one of the consistent threads throughout my research over the years has been the interdisciplinary aspect of my work. Even when I was still a PhD student, I found myself interested in the social science of psychology, the way the human mind works. And I was fascinated by and wanted to develop my knowledge further related to how the mind becomes aware of the natural world, and also how we lose awareness, how our awareness rises and falls. And I was particularly interested from the very beginning of my professional work in ecological literary studies in basically the psychology of environmental literature and the psychology of environmental communication. And the talk that I'm going to give to you now is basically in that vein, taking certain psychological ideas and trying to apply them to the way human beings respond to certain types of textual prompts. So my title is In Medias Res. Basically, that's Latin for in the middle of things. And I first learned that concept in relation to literary texts that start in the middle of a story. And I learned that in medias res refers to a story that begins in the middle rather than obviously at the beginning. To me, it seemed like an appropriate way to identify the fact that we continue to be in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the fact that many people around the world are behaving as if the pandemic occurred in the past and we are now beyond the pandemic. I don't believe that to be true. And in fact, I think we should continue to try to learn from the COVID pandemic as much as we can, because we may need these lessons in order to help us survive the environmental crisis, the global environmental crisis that we have brought upon ourselves. So I'm quite interested in what I call in my title, complacency and vigilance. Why is it that we've become so complacent during the ongoing pandemic? 1 year ago, in May 2021, when I was serving as a Fulbright scholar at Cappadocia University in central Turkey, I gave several lectures by Zoom while I was in Turkey. No one was in the room with me. I was alone and using the virtual technology of Zoom to speak to people in Turkey and in various other countries. My final lecture in Turkey was in person, but everybody was wearing a mask and we were trying to keep socially distant from each other. That was only 1 year ago. In fact, I was in a large lecture hall like the one that some of you are in at Bishop Heber College, and there were only this many people in the entire hall. They didn't allow more people because they wanted the attendees to be socially distant from each other. We were very vigilant and concerned about exposure to the contagious virus. But now we've entered a period of apparent complacency. And so I wonder how literature might be able to push us beyond complacency and toward an ongoing necessary feeling of vigilance toward the pandemic, and also possibly toward other threats, such as the threats we face due to environmental degradation. At the same time, I think I'll say a few words about the practice of medical environmental humanities research during the ongoing pandemic. About 2 years ago, a few of my colleagues from India and I began a project to bring together the medical humanities and the environmental humanities. And we found that the publisher in the UK, Bloomsbury Academic, wanted us to produce a large book called the Bloomsbury Handbook to Medical Environmental Humanities. And this book contains about 30 articles focusing on many different aspects of the interconnection between human health and environmental concern or environmental protection, including both physical health, injuries of various kinds, such as exposure to dangerous viruses, and the environmental implications of these human health experiences. And in addition to physical health, mental health, such as the use of contact with nature as a way of overcoming depression. And there's an entire chapter by a colleague from the UK focusing on the eco-despair memoir, the way to overcome grief and despair of various kinds, depression, by way of certain types of contact with nature, and other essays on how physical displacement, such as living in exile, might cause psychological trauma. That's an intertwining of a human health situation and a relationship to the natural world. But in this book also, one of the constant themes is our relationship to viruses and also our relationship to other species, which sometimes leads to the spillover transfer of viruses, that what's called the zoonotic transfer of viruses from one species to another. So all of this is explored in the new book, the Bloomsbury Handbook to Medical Environmental Humanities, which is coming out next month in August. And there are several Indian contributors to the book writing about topics particularly relevant to Indian culture. So I'm going to talk about some new research that I'm doing and try to give you a little bit of background about that. Let me see if I can advance my slides. Okay, so the premise of my talk is that the COVID pandemic is ongoing. And yet the topic of COVID, the pandemic, seems to have drifted away from most of the news headlines, certainly in the United States. You know, we hear a lot about economic crisis, about the war in Eastern Europe. We hear about new diseases such as monkeypox, which are becoming dangerously prevalent. in the United States and in certain other countries. But I believe we should try to learn from the pandemic that we have been experiencing for the past few years and not simply ignore it and try to go back to our pre-pandemic lives. The pandemic that we experienced was a very profound experience. It disrupted our daily lives and our professional lives in really dramatic and significant ways that can teach us, I believe. And so that's part of what I would like to get to in my remarks today. Also, regarding the fact that the pandemic is not finished, the COVID pandemic, just in doing some quick searches in the past few days, it seems to me that has been an average of nearly 20,000 cases per day reported in India in the past week. And in the United States, there have been 130,000 new cases of COVID announced each day during the past several days, specifically the new BA.5 variant, which may be a little bit less potent, but is still very contagious, maybe more contagious than some of the earlier variants. So the chart that I have here from the New York Times actually shows that there were peaks of COVID contagion in May of 2020. This is in India specifically, in May of 2021 and in March of 2022. But if you look at the far right part of the screen, there is currently an upsurge of cases in India, just as there is an upsurge, an increase of cases of COVID in the US right now. So I'm quite unhappy that there's a complacency that seems to be taking place in the United States at this time when we should remain vigilant. And it seems to me that we can learn something about the fluctuation of attention between complacency and vigilance in our various societies with regard to COVID, because in the environmental context, we also experience inappropriate complacency toward phenomena such as global climate change, the sixth mega extinction, microplastics in the ocean, the rampant spread of toxicity such as dioxin spread as a result of industry. There are many important dimensions to the ongoing ecological crisis around the world, and we have a strange and dangerous level of complacency in our societies. And there are many ways of explaining this. Part of it is simply human attention and our inability to pay attention to so many desperate situations at the same time. But I do think there are certain overarching crises that require us to pay more attention than we are. Otherwise, it's very likely that our species is going to suffer considerably in the coming years. So I would like to know why we've become so complacent during the ongoing pandemic and what we can learn from this experience of complacency about trying to stimulate and maintain appropriate vigilance. So in my town in Eugene, Oregon, we hosted the World Track and Field Championships last week, and almost nobody in the large stadium, athletes or spectators, was wearing a mask except my brother and I and a few others. My brother is a physician, a surgeon, and the two of us sat in our seats and watched the splendid athletic performances wearing masks. But most people, like the man that I took a picture of here under the scoreboard, were not wearing masks. And in fact, on the screen here on the giant scoreboard is one of the Indian participants in the meet, a well-known Indian javelin thrower named Neeraj Chopra. There were a lot of Indians competing and a lot of maskless spectators who seemed to feel as if there was little danger of catching COVID, but I don't feel that's the case. So from the very beginning of the pandemic, environmental humanities scholars like me have been trying to use our expertise or our whatever knowledge we happen to have in environmental humanities to try to understand the pandemic. And in June of 2020, the Swedish website called Bifrost, or bifrost.org, orchestrated a cluster of articles, around 12 new articles responding to the pandemic from the environmental humanities perspective. And many of the contributors were interested in what we could learn about our coexistence with other species, such as the animals from which we likely received COVID. Could be bats, could be pangolins, and our relatively careless interaction with these species may very well have led to the initial contagion or spillover of the disease from those other species to our own in China, in 2019, and eventually this became a global pandemic. So what can we learn from the pandemic about our interactions with other species? David Pello from the University of California, Santa Barbara, wrote his short article about environmental justice and what we could learn about environmental justice during the pandemic, particularly the plight of people in prisons who were not able to achieve social distance because they lived in close proximity to each other and were exposed to this very dangerous virus. So he wrote specifically about prisons in the United States. My own article for this, or actually, before I talk about my own article, the centerpiece of that collection for Bifrost was an open letter to colleagues working in the field of the environmental humanities. It was actually drafted by the ecofeminist scholar Greta Gard. And the letter that many of us signed, scholars from around the world signed, particularly highlighted two special aspects of what we had learned already in 2020 from the pandemic, that we could manage to accomplish our work as environmental humanities scholars and scholars in other fields without so much air travel. And I have loved my own earlier visits to many countries around the world, including India. But one of the great revelations for me during the pandemic has been the ability to use Zoom and other platforms, as we are right now, in order to present ideas and engage with colleagues and teach classes. So we can actually limit a lot of our use of jet fuel thanks to the existing technologies. And so this open letter from the Bifrost collection suggests that the enforced constraints of the COVID-19 pandemic have revealed to us how much we can still accomplish without elective travel for physical meetings. Another idea from the from this letter is that we can learn from the pandemic how closely our lives are entangled with and engaged with the lives of other species, and that we might actually use this moment to be more mindful of these relationships and the appropriate and the brutal treatment of various other species. And so that we might become more mindful about our diet and make ecological choices in what we choose to eat or not eat. So these ideas about our engagement with other species and our use of fossil fuel to travel were particularly highlighted in that aspect of the Bifrost collection. My own essay focused on various psychological aspects of the pandemic experience. And the first point that I made, and I write about this to a great extent, and it's led to new types of research, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, my first point is that there was a growing sense of universal vulnerability. Before the pandemic, we knew that there were certain communities, human communities, that were particularly vulnerable, at risk due to environmental justice situations, due to phenomena such as climate change, people living near seacoasts, living on islands, were especially in jeopardy and vulnerable because of where they lived and sometimes because of their socioeconomic situation. But during the pandemic, especially in the early months of the pandemic, all of us felt nervous about our safety. All of us felt much more vulnerable than before, even those of us who were relatively secure in a socioeconomic sense. And I view that as a good thing. We all had a taste of vulnerability, or what scholars in the humanities call precarity. We began to realize that precarity had the potential to affect all of us, not only certain communities. Another idea is we became more aware of the human mind's insensitivity to exponential change. This includes extinctions, which occur naturally at a low level, but in recent decades, the rate of extinction in the non-human world has risen to a completely different level. We are in the middle now of what's called a mega extinction, with a rampant disappearance of many species around the world. And so it starts slowly, and then it increases exponentially to a point where it's sort of a runaway train out of control. And global climate change is very much like this as well. It began very slowly and modestly with certain upward blips of global warming and slightly erratic climate patterns. And now temperatures are really getting out of control all around the world. Every year is hotter than any previous year. And polar ice is melting, which is changing the jet streams in the oceans, affecting weather patterns, resulting in tremendous perturbations or disturbances, kind of chaos in weather systems, droughts and mega storms, which are increasingly becoming out of control. But it all happens so slowly that we hardly are aware of it until it's out of control. And the pandemic also, the way it seemed to start slowly with only a few cases, and then through social contact and the spread of disease, many other people got sick. So we all had this rather direct and vivid experience of exponential change that we can learn from and apply to various other aspects of our lives. A few other points that came to me early in the pandemic and that I wrote about in this article, which I called COVID World, COVID Mind, toward a new consciousness, was that our interactions with the animal world, with other species, have genuine consequences for human beings through the zoonotic spillover of disease. And also, we learned what it means to put on the cultural brakes, to actually stop our lives during lockdowns and try to survive after changing society in dramatic ways, changing certain basic aspects of our lifestyles, which most of us had never had an opportunity to experiment with before the pandemic. So also fundamental to certain aspects of the research I'm going to describe in a moment is Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor. The slowness and imperceptibility of violent, destructive phenomena, ranging from pandemics to climate change, is something that many of us were aware of prior to Nixon's book. But Nixon's term, slow violence, is very poignant and poetic and eloquent. And it's a good way of describing violence that occurs gradually and out of sight. And he says, we need to engage a different kind of violence, a violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and accretive, its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales. So the fact that destructive phenomena in the world are not always visible or perceptible in any way. Often they occur slowly, far away, and in ways that the human senses and even the human mind strain to perceive. We struggle to perceive. And I think we can learn something about the imperceptibility of the COVID-19 virus. You couldn't see it anywhere around you. We still can't. And we have a tendency to feel that the virus is not there if we can't perceive it. And yet it's circulating around us. It's there if we're not careful, and we are at risk if we allow ourselves to be exposed to the COVID virus. And likewise, we are at risk, all of us around the world, because of what we're doing through various types of environmental degradation, including, chief among them, I would say, global climate change. So I'm interested in the idea that pandemic literature and climate literature might inspire positive, or in other words, pro-social thinking among readers, and that by exposing people to literature and film and other forms of cultural expression related to pandemics, related to climate change, we might help to stimulate, in particular, a feeling of precarity, a sense of vulnerability that I view as a potentially positive state of mind. Most people might think we want to avoid the feeling of precarity. We want to feel secure and safe, not precarious. But I believe precarity is a form of mindfulness, and that we want to increase our sense of precarity so that we live more carefully, more mindfully. We take care in our lifestyles. We use natural resources carefully. We preserve water. We protect other species, and we protect habitat. And we don't simply use fossil fuels in a mindless, enthusiastic way when we actually know intellectually that fossil fuels are leading to the destruction of the environment, and could very well lead to the, and I'm not exaggerating, to the extinction of the human species due to the increasing uninhabitability of the planet. And if we continue in the direction we're going in with fossil fuels and other types of mindless resource use and degradation of the environment, this is going to be a very hard planet for most species to live on, certainly for species like ourselves. So I wonder how all people, including those in the global north, people who have hitherto lived rather secure and calm and complacent lives, might develop a salutary or a healthy sense of precarity, a new mindfulness, or what I sometimes call a full stomach sense of eco-precarity. You may be familiar with Ramachandra Guha and Joan Martinez Alier's work on full stomach environmentalism of the North and empty belly environmentalism of the global South, the developing world. Well, and the global South historically has had a sense of precarity, precarity to the environment and precarity in their own human lives. But I think one of the goals of exposure to pandemic and climate literature and culture is what I've called here a full stomach or a global north sense of eco-precarity. Because many of us in the global north, we use resources in a mindless and destructive way. Also related to this research is the psychology of insensitivity toward information and how we might overcome it. So in 2015, I compiled a book together with my father, who's a psychology professor. The book is called Numbers and Nerves, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data. And we discuss psychological phenomena such as psychic numbing, the fact that we are quickly overwhelmed by numbers, Any number larger than one, in fact, leads to a kind of numbness or insensitivity in the human brain. Even people who are good at mathematics feel this. They're more sensitive to the individual than they are to the group. And so the human mind has a tragic insensitivity to large-scale phenomena. I'll say that again. The human mind has a tragic insensitivity to large-scale phenomena, whether we're talking about humanitarian crises or ecological phenomena. That as soon as a phenomenon becomes large, and that, in other words, becomes significant, our minds are less interested. We pay less attention to the big and important phenomena than we do to individual cases. Another aspect of this psychology, which my father and I call the arithmetic of compassion, is pseudo-inefficacy. If we feel we can't make any difference, for instance, if a number of people are in danger and we can't help everyone, we are less inclined to make any effort to help anyone. And the same thing is true in an environmental context. If the problem seems big and we fear that we can't make any difference, we don't even want to bother. And this is called pseudo-inefficacy, because in reality, we do have the ability to make a difference, maybe a small difference, but if all of us work together, we make a real difference. We can really change society, and we can change our collective impacts on the planet. So the feeling of inefficacy is false. It is a pseudo feeling rather than a real feeling. And then there are various other psychological phenomena that I'm not going to go into now, but we discuss them in the book and in the website that we've created out of this book. Let me move on. So how should we feel about the value of saving lives, for instance, or protecting other phenomena that we believe too important? If we believe every human life is equally important, then we should, as the number of lives in danger increases, the value of these lives should also increase. That's the chart on the left, the graph on the left. Or as more and more people or honeybees or other pollinators or species become endangered, their value increases due to the potential of a devastating, catastrophic loss of an entire colony of pollinators or an entire society of human beings. So these are normative models. So, I mean, in a rational, analytical view, this is how we should be thinking. The reality is, due to the psychology of our insensitivity to phenomena, to numbers of phenomena, that it's called psychophysical numbing. Phenomena become abstract for us very quickly, even at number 2. So by the time we're talking about parts per million of particles of particulates in the atmosphere, the human mind just turns off and ceases to pay attention. It's a pretty devastating aspect of the way the human mind works. So we assume, this hasn't really been fully studied by psychologists or by environmental humanities scholars like me, but we assume that we can begin to slightly overcome or chip away at these psychological tendencies toward insensitivity through such approaches as communicating multidimensionally with images, stories, personalized individual faces, and by understanding the psychological processes by which we respond to information, which is what I was just talking about. So I find myself trying to develop new experiments that study the way the human mind of research subjects respond to information or textual prompts. I do some of this work with my father, a psychologist named Paul Slovik. I also work with various other scholars in the social sciences and in communication studies. So as I said earlier, we published a book on this subject in 2015, and we've turned it into a website called arithmeticofcompassion.org, which delves into the psychological and environmental humanities principles, and then attempts to apply these ideas to current situations around the world, humanitarian crises and environmental crises. And in recent months, I've been working with a team of colleagues to develop new empirical eco-critical projects to understand how the psychology of representing precarity or precarity representation actually works. And in particular, locally, I'm working with my father and with a colleague named David Markowitz, who's a communications studies scholar. So we're interested in using psychological concepts such as emotional contagion, the idea that if you represent emotion, such as a feeling of precarity in a text, that has a contagious effect on audiences who are exposed to that text. This is an idea that psychologists have developed. Also, the notion of mortality salience, stories about mortality, about susceptibility to very dangerous things that could kill someone, are particularly salient or powerful. And so what I'd really like to do is develop certain theories of emotional contagion, the spread of emotion or narrative contagion, spreading certain feelings of healthy precarity by way of exposure to narrative. And this is David Markowitz, one of the scholars I'm working with. So this is work that we would refer to as empirical eco-criticism, designing a social science-like research study where we identify textual prompts, and then we come up with experimental questionnaires and find a way to pass these out, usually through the internet, to numerous experimental subjects. And then we gather data on how these subjects respond to our questionnaires after they have been prompted by certain readings or other kinds of textual prompts. So basically, empirical eco-criticism is uses empirical approaches to combine social scientific and humanistic methodologies to ground, refine, and test common claims about textual influence and impact. And these empirical approaches include conducting interviews, using focus groups, using surveys, or doing controlled experiments. And so what I'm working on with David Markowitz is to develop experiments that use survey questionnaires. And in particular, we're asking the question, how does reading a pandemic-related textual prompt change people's sense of personal vulnerability? And here, for instance, is a prompt from one of the pandemic novels that I find very interesting. And I've written some articles about Peter Heller's 2011 novel called The Dog Stars. As a more traditional environmental humanities scholar, I've written these articles, but now I'm trying to do an empirical study exposing people to passages like this one to see whether reading this kind of story where the narrator has to kill his wife who's sick with a deadly influenza virus. She's too sick to survive. She's in terrible discomfort, terrible pain, and she asks her husband to suffocate her with a pillow. And it's a wrenching, terrible, painful passage. And I'm wondering whether reading literary texts that tell this kind of story will help readers to intensify their sense of vigilance toward the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic, and also a sense of vigilance toward other vulnerabilities that they might have in the world, such as vulnerability to global climate change. So again, the theory behind this work includes such articles as this one from 2014, experimental evidence of massive scale emotional contagion. Reading literary texts or reading written texts spreads emotional feelings. I consider that a good possibility for spreading such feelings of vulnerability or precarity through literature, especially because of notions of empathy and the fact that, you know, if you study narrative empathy, you realize that when people are telling stories, there's a strong tendency among readers to identify with and feel empathy toward fictional characters, whether human or non-human. And so the Suzanne Keen's notions of empathy and the novel suggests that there might be a strong ability for fictional narratives or first-person narratives in general to transfer important feelings to readers. So I'm almost finished here and ready for some Q&A. My studies of literary precarity and human non-human exceptionalism fit within the scholarly context of other recent publications. So I'm interested in articulating to audiences that there is an existential threat to human survival as a result of the kind of planet that we have produced through our technological behaviors, particularly our burning of fossil fuels. So McFarlane's 2021 book, a work of eco-criticism, is titled Eco-Collapse Fiction and Cultures of Human Exceptionalism. And basically, she argues that we must learn to reject the impulse of human exceptionalism that she says pervades Western thought in particular, and a lot of literature even, this idea that humans will somehow survive. We are exceptional, we are different, we are not prone to extinction like other species. But there are certain examples of literary fiction, such as Cormac McCarthy's The Road, and the novel that my own study is based on, Peter Heller's novel, The Dog Stars, that actually show humans experiencing existential peril, the possibility or the likelihood of extinction. And so McFarlane's work, and I would say some of my own recent work, is built upon this notion that actually we can't think of ourselves as being different from other species. We must recognize our own extreme vulnerability to mortality, and potentially on a larger scale to even to human extinction, and that recognizing that will lead possibly to a sense of positive precarity that may allow us to slowly switch directions for our societies, so that nothing else seems to be working, and we need to find something to do if we're going to survive the predicament that we're in right now. So my guiding question is whether we can use certain concepts from psychology, such as psychic numbing, emotional contagion, and mortality salience, and from the environmental humanities, such as eco-precarity, apprehension, and non-exceptionalism, to understand how narratives might spur a healthy sense of mindfulness and urgent caution in readers or experimental subjects for empirical studies, and help them to become more sensitive to the difficult to perceive and difficult to understand processes of slow violence. So this is the sort of project that I'm working on. I have to get some funding from research agencies in order to conduct these experiments. But this is what I'm doing. And Dr. Shanti, in her introduction, referred to my longtime friend and colleague, Cheryl Glattfeldt, the leading and foundational eco-critic, who's now retired from her professorship at the University of Nevada. And she spends her time doing a very precarious activity, highlining. She's basically walking across a rope over a huge canyon in Yosemite National Park. She's attached to the rope. There's a cord attaching her, so she wouldn't fall completely if she were to slip off the line. But it seems like a very dangerous and precarious activity. And I wonder whether reading certain kinds of pandemic texts might stimulate healthy feelings of precarity without requiring us to walk across great chasms. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I welcome any comments or questions. Thanks for your attention.
Scott Slovic, through his enlightening presentation on in medias res, complacency, vigilance, and the practice of medical environmental humanities research during the ongoing COVID pandemic, he reinforced the idea that we as a human community do have the power to change and help, provided we overcome the pseudo inefficacy. Thank you, sir. We are grateful to you for sharing with us your wealth of expertise, where you urged that we can overcome psychological tendencies by communicating multidimensionally with images, narratives, and stories, personalized stories. You spoke on emotional contagion, mortality salience, and narrative contagion as ways to achieve heightened vigilance. Your presentation sure has given all of us the impetus to venture into this area of research. On behalf of the Department of English, Bishop Heber College, I thank you for an amazing time and inspiring presence today. Thank you, sir. Take this home, Potterheads. Dr. Scott is just echoing the warning by our favorite Mad-Eye Moody, constant vigilance. That's our solution. Thank you. So now the floor is open for questions. Participants, please post your questions in the chat box.
Audience, do we have any questions? So we have a question. Shall I read it for you, sir?
Sure. Are you talking about the question from Ina Suhenko?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead and read it.
Dear Scott, thank you. Will you be so kind as to comment on the role of storytelling in over-emoting the pandemic on one hand, and on the other hand, creating the textually fabulous nature of fear, uncertainty? Yes, Derrida was speaking about that, referring to a nuclear war threat a long time ago, which makes us doomed, scared, and paralyzed. What is your opinion about the idea promoted by Ernest Bloch in his The Principles of Hope, that any crisis, uncertainty, as well as precarity is a starting point for hope?
Thank you. That's a really great and fascinating question. I do think there is the danger of exaggerating fear and a sense of fatalism that could result in indifference or nihilism, a kind of giving up of hope. And in fact, many scholars in the environmental humanities these days, such as Sarah Jaquette Ray, have been writing about climate anxiety, especially in particular demographics, such as university students. Sarah Jaquette Ray has a recent book called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. And her book is addressed specifically to university students, concerned that people may just feel it's hopeless. There's nothing we can do. The situation of the human species on Earth is going to get worse and worse, and this is inevitable. I think this can be studied empirically as well, to see whether certain types of texts, such as the one that I shared with you, that very grim and desperate passage from the Dog Stars, where the narrator is is preparing to suffocate his wife to death because she's mortally ill with virus. Passages like that can seem so bleak that they might lead to a sense of hopelessness. So in a way, I guess what I think we need to understand is how to calibrate narrative so that it wakes us up, it slaps us in the face and gives us a sense of urgency without giving us a feeling of inevitable doom. And that's the challenge. There may be a particular band, a particular variety of narrative that is especially good at inspiring vigilance without pushing us over the edge toward despair, toward such extreme anxiety that we become paralyzed and decide, well, let's stick our heads in the sand like ostriches and go on with our lives as usual because there's nothing we can do. And this feeling of paralysis that you write about this is kind of related, I think, to pseudo-inefficacy. We become so paralyzed by the magnitude of the crises that we face on the earth that we fear that we can't make any difference. When in reality, if all of us committed ourselves to trying to make small differences in our lifestyles and in what we tell our elected government leaders to do and our corporate leaders, we would make a difference. So the feeling of inefficacy is actually false, but many of us feel it when we simply look at the size of the problems. So I don't know if that's a very focused response to your question, but I think what you're saying is very much related to ideas like climate anxiety and how it is that we can overcome climate anxiety. And I would urge you and other colleagues to look at Sarah Jaquette Ray's recent book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, for further ideas about this. It looks like there are some other questions. Would someone like to read these out loud, and then I'll try to respond to them quickly?
Sure, sir. The next question is, there are folklores and myths existing in different parts of the world. These myths are mostly connected to the environment of that place. Will research on such eco-myths be helpful?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's often environmental mythologies are intricately intertwined with local cultures. And I believe, as well as reaching toward universal archetypal human experience, there's something intimate and local about mythologies. And so researching these local and culturally specific mythologies would be one way of suggesting to societies around the world that there's a long tradition of paying attention to the more than human world, and that their local societies are deeply invested in such thinking. So these aren't, one of the dangers of the kind of lecture that I just gave to you is that it may feel very Western centered or very North American. And of course, I'm mindful that I'm speaking to an audience that's largely in India, although other friends and colleagues are attending, such as my longtime colleague Ina Suhenko, who asked the first question, who's Ukrainian but living in Finland. So there are some people elsewhere, but what are the regional mythologies from your parts of the world, and how can they demonstrate good ideas, thoughtful, profound forms of mindfulness about the relationship between humans and the larger world that have existed long before modern ideas. And often I find that some of the smartest ways of thinking are not just in the most cutting edge recent vocabularies and theories, but actually in ideas that seem to circle back to much more traditional ways of thinking. It's not to say that I am an absolute critic of modernity. I think we can achieve some really wonderful things with modern technology and with modern theories, but I'm also not entirely enamored of some traditional ideas, which are often more extreme reinforcing social stratification and other things. But I believe that there are many wonderful and important ideas from traditional cultures that we should not throw by the wayside, and we should find a way to recover them and bring them back into our contemporary lives. So the study of eco-myths is one way of doing that. How about another question?
Professor Scott Slovak, thank you so much for the thought-provoking session. I wonder how the apparently contradictory sociological positions of a growing sense of universal vulnerability and insensitivity to exponential changes coexist in human psyche. If that is so, it makes a change rather difficult.
Yeah, right, absolutely. I think, in the early days and weeks of the pandemic, I believe we were able to snap ourselves out of this insensitivity. Didn't you feel this in your own lives? At the time when we were all locked down and we were afraid to go and speak to our neighbors because we didn't know whether the virus would somehow leap across through our breath and contaminate us. Or I wouldn't even, for months, I didn't go into a grocery store and buy groceries. Everything seemed frightening and dangerous in the early days of the pandemic. So even though at the same time we were proving that we were insensitive to the rapid growth of the numbers of cases in our various communities, we were also strangely vulnerable. I agree, there's a kind of contradictory psychological response there. At this point in our lives, many of us feel a growing sense of complacency, like the pandemic, that's old history. That happened in 2019 and 2020, maybe a little bit in 2021. This is 2022, the pandemic is gone. The reality is there are still a lot of cases of COVID and new variants appearing. So I think it's important to recognize that the human mind is intrinsically insensitive to large numbers, and also to change that occurs slowly, starts slowly and then increases rapidly through exponential processes. So by recognizing that in our own minds, in our own ways of responding to information, I think we can push back against it and be a little bit more sensitive. So as I said repeatedly in my talk, I believe a certain degree of precarity, a certain level of a feeling of vulnerability is actually positive because it makes us more careful and more mindful. And when we realize that our minds are becoming insensitive to information, we're not paying enough attention, we can push harder to try to be more sensitive and be more careful. This is true not only in the context of the pandemic, but in the context of the many environmental crises that we face right now, which may not be in the headlines. We may not find these in the news media at all. So we have to work pretty hard to try to gather information and be sensitive to the implications of that information. And we can learn from our experience with the pandemic to be more sensitive to other kinds of important information. That's the argument I'm trying to make.
Thank you, sir. There is one more question. Thank you, sir, for enlightening us. Sir, will you please elaborate relating psychology and environment in literature from research point of view?
Well, this is a very big question. There are many different ways of applying psychological ideas to environmental literature. As I may have suggested in my lecture, I've been doing this for many years. I was interested in psychology when I was a PhD student, perhaps because I grew up in a family with a psychological researcher, my father. And so when I was writing my PhD dissertation on American environmental literature, I was interested in the psychology of awareness, the theme of awareness or consciousness in environmental texts. And so My book, Seeking Awareness in American Nature Writing, is an early example of relating psychology and environment in literature. Since that time, there have been many other approaches to the psychological aspects of environmental texts. There are a number of scholars. There's someone named Susan Rowland, for instance, Rowland, who has a book on Jungian psychological ideas as a lens through which to read environmental texts. So applying ideas about the unconscious and tracing these specific Jungian theories. More recently, we have people like Sarah Jaquette Ray, whose family name is R-A-Y, Ray, and her book on climate anxiety. And there's another scholar named Jennifer Atkinson from the University of Washington, who has done a lot of work on psychology, the experience of climate change, and environmental literature. Some people adopt clinical psychological approaches, looking at mental health and psychology. There's one article by someone named Samantha Walton from the UK in this new book on Handbook to Medical Environmental Humanities, who studies the eco-despair memoir and the connections with nature that can improve the psychological conditions of people. And in particular, she looks at books like Helen Macdonald's well-known British memoir, H is for Hawk, where the narrator, the author, writes about losing her father and the trauma of that experience, and how the experience of training a hawk, basically a raptor, a bird of prey, training that bird and establishing a relationship with this bird enabled her to overcome the psychological distress that she was experiencing. So Samantha Walton's article is a psychological approach to this particular genre, the eco-despair memoir, explaining the psychological aspects of that literature. But there are, I'm sure, many, many other psychological approaches that could be applied to environmental texts. And I don't really have a chance to, or a time to go into that right now. In fact, that would be a good research topic to do a thesis or an article that writes about the varieties of psychological approaches to environmental texts. So thank you for that question. I believe there are some other questions. I see there are other messages. And I wish I had time to go into more detail, but I don't know if I have any more time right now, or if we need to have a break before the next presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. The session was the question and answer session as well as your presentation were very invigorating. Thank you for your presence. I would also like to welcome and thank Dr. Joyce for her presence. She's the valedictory speaker. She is here among us. She has joined online. Thank you, ma'am, for your presence again.
Hi, Joyce. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Anyway, it's good to see you. Well, thank you very much to all of you. I realize we're at the end of our session, but I appreciate the invitation to speak to you, and I wish you all the best for the remaining sessions of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for this wonderful session. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Welcome, Dr. Nirmal, sir.
Good afternoon, one and all. I welcome Dr. Nirmal Selvamani to this session. A short introduction of Sir. Professor Dr. Nirmal Selvamani is an esteemed writer and eco-critic, a former professor and head Department of English Studies, Dean of Central University, Tamil Nadu. Sir has a rich teaching experience across many institutes in India and abroad. Dr. Nirmal is instrumental in introducing the course Eco-Criticism for the first time in Indian universities and founded the forum now known as Thinai. He coined the term Neo-Thinai poetics, which is based on Thinai poetry of classical Tamil literature. He has been honored with various awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award by Northeast Ohio Tamil Sangam, Ohio, US. Sir is also a multifaceted personality whose other interests include music, drama, and languages. In 2002, he was the secretary of Forum for Advanced Research in Tamil Musicology, Madurai. Thank you for joining us today, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. It was wonderful listening to Professor Scott Slowick. So here I am in a different time zone, but I'm happy to be connecting with you all right now. Though I've never been so far away from Bishop Heber College. But I hope what I'm going to say to you will not be very distant to you anyway. Dr. Sobana, the convener, Dr. Shanti, the organizing secretary, Reverend Dr. Chandrasekharan, the Bishop of Trichy Diocese, Dr. Dayabaran, principal of the college, Dr. Satyaseelan, vice principal, Dr. Suresh Frederick and Dr. Dayabal, advisors of this event, all of the organizing committee members, Professor Scott Slowick, and other distinguished speakers, Dr. Bhagyam, faculty member of the Department of English of this college, Professor Bennett, and all the participants in this event. My vanakkam to you all, and I wish you all a very good time of the day in whichever part of the world you are at the moment. I want to thank Dr. Sobana, Dr. Shanti, and Dr. Suresh Frederick for inviting me to give a talk in this conference. And I'm very happy to continue my eco-criticism related conversation with Bishop Heber that started about 20 years ago. I want to congratulate Dr. Sobana, Dr. Shanti, and Dr. Frederick for their commitment to the courses and fostering research and eco-criticism in this institution. Particularly, I admire the zeal with which Dr. Suresh Frederick started this course in this college and has nurtured it all these years amazingly well. The title of my presentation is actually a question. When is the literary imagination green enough? When is the literary imagination green enough? And the answer to my title question is also the thesis of this presentation. The literary imagination is green enough only when it orients itself to what I have elsewhere called Thinaidal, or the making of the Thinai home. I will begin with a stanza from Andrew Marvell's poem, The Garden, which was published, I think, in 1681, the late 17th century. And please consider this stanza as my prologue in this presentation. Here it is. Meanwhile, the mind, from pleasureless, withdraws into its happiness. The mind, that ocean where each kind does straight its own resemblance find, yet it creates, transcending these, far other worlds and other seas, annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. This stanza tells us that imagination could create other worlds and other seas, probably even utopias, by annihilating the real world and reducing it to a green thought. In this creation, the mind finds its own happiness. What the stanza does not say is the possibility of poets imagining utopias made possible by industrialism, which annihilates or destroys the real world and reduces it to mere green thoughts. The mind believes that it finds happiness from imaginatively creating destructive industrialist utopias. But it's not the mind deluding itself, because what it considers happiness is not really happiness. Marvel's stanza could not have said what it did not say, probably because it was composed about 60 years before the Industrial Revolution, which destroyed the world he had known. One of the popular misconceptions about imagination is that it is a useless and probably even dangerous mental faculty. Useless because it is the opposite of practicality. Dangerous because it is wielded by people like the poets Plato wanted to banish from his republic. Because it reminds us of people like the artists and writers who are punished or effectively ignored today, even in democracies, let alone autocracies. But artists and literary critics have told us how vital imagination is for poetry and other forms of art. Philosophers have shown how imagination is inseparable from action, even practical everyday action. In fact, imagination transgresses the boundary between the real and the not yet real. Today, my focus is not on imagination as such, but on the greening of it. I would like to remind ourselves that imagination is not enough, even that of canonical poets. Imagination may not be beneficial if it's not green enough. If so, when does imagination become adequately green? To think through this, let us dwell on the idea of greenness a while before we turn to greening itself. To do so, I want to revisit the keynote I gave at the Second International Conference of Thine, which was then called Osle, India, in Bengaluru in 2007. I had titled my presentation, Revisiting Greenness. Therefore, this revisiting now is a revisiting of what was already revisited in 2007. The adjective green has been widely used today all over the world in different contexts, all of which are somehow associated with either nature or environment or ecology. It means nature in the name of the field called green cultural studies. According to the scholar Hodgman, I quote him, green cultural studies is the examination of nature through words, image, and model for the purpose of foregrounding potential effects representation might have on cultural attitudes and social practices, which in turn affect nature itself. I end his quote. We may like to think that green is always a synonym of environmental, as in the phrase Green Party, for example. Green denotes environment in other words also. Look at the words green accounting, green audit, green ban, green consumer, green economics, green peace, green tax, green wash, among many others. In such phrases as green consumerism, green capitalism, and green defense, green does not denote environment, but a kind of consumerism, a kind of capitalism, a kind of defense advocated by the Greens. Consider the word green movement, which is an umbrella term for a number of varied movements. But what about the term green revolution? It's neither an equivalent of environmental revolution nor a revolutionary green politics, but actually agricultural revolution. So green could mean agriculture also. Again, in the phrase green cover, green certainly does not include all kinds of environment, say, for example, urban environment. But on the other hand, restricts itself to just one type of natural environment, namely the forest or vegetation. A green belt is an area of vegetation, such as, I quote, fields and parks around a town or city that is protected from any building, I end quote. Likewise, the green in green manure refers to plants rather than to environment. The terms greenhouse gas and greenhouse effect are derivations from greenhouse, in which green denotes plants. In short, since the color green seems to have different shades of meaning, it's necessary to know all about them so that we could choose the shade we want and avoid the one that we do not. Natural greenness is associated with vegetation. The concept of green chimney is based on the idea of natural greenness. To most governments in the world today, greenness is a synonym of vegetation or environment which surrounds a human. When used with verbal force, as in to green or greening, we're talking about having more vegetation, perhaps afforestation, or creating lawns or planting avenue trees. When there was plenty of vegetation around, this type of greenness was not privileged in government projects and policies. Later, with excessive deforestation and clearing, there was a drastic loss of vegetation. When the consequences of this loss dawned on governments, they began to prioritize the problem of depletion of vegetation in their agendas. But the new natural greenness favored by the governments is not quite the same as the original natural greenness it replaces. An original patch of greenery is cleared to create a human settlement. When the settlement gets degraded and polluted, the government advocates green measures to enhance the quality of the settlement. These green measures include parks and avenue trees, the so-called lungs of urban spaces. In the midst of soot and toxic gases, avenue trees and park vegetation struggle very hard to remain alive, and if alive, healthy. Greenness is also imagined as a kind of thought, as in the poem, the stanza I read out to you. It is spoken of as thought because the real world in this view is not green enough. The speaker persona of Andrew Marvell does not deny the existence of the greenness of the real world, but he wishes to annihilate the real world so that he could have only the thought of greenness or mental greenness, which in his opinion is probably superior to real greenery. In most of the instances mentioned above, greenness is an objective entity either vegetation or environment or agriculture, or an abstract entity like thought. Even when we speak of some cultural artifacts as being green, we are referring to a kind of objective greenness or an aspect of an object in such cultural objects. For example, a car becomes green when it runs on electricity, which is a kind of green or clean energy. Does greenness refer to a human when we say so-and-so is a green? What about the exclamation, the Greens have won the elections? Andrew Dobson makes a fine distinction between green with a lowercase g and green with an uppercase G. He uses lowercase green for those who think that environmental problems can be solved within the present political and economic system, and green with a capital G for those who think that it can't be. In both cases, greenness refers to attitude to environment. If the lowercase green denotes an attitude which legitimizes economic development of the environment, the uppercase green does an attitude that endorses sustainable development of the environment. In fact, green in both cases refers to an attitude rather than the person who has the attitude. On the basis of the approach to the environment, Dobson identifies two categories of persons, the reformists and the radicals. The reformists are those who seek to reform the existing degreening society by trying to address environmental issues which surface from time to time, and the radicals as those who insist on structural change of such society. A scholar named Ganger describes the reformists as those who argue that environmental aims can be achieved by working within the system, that Western political institutions are broad and flexible enough to accomplish the goals of social justice and environmental protection. Now, he's talking about the Western situation. This group includes so many organizations, including the United Nations Environmental Program, the Sierra Club, the Wilderness Society, the Audubon Society, Friends of the Earth, and many others. Those who identify themselves as utilitarians could also be a type of reformers. They emphasize the usefulness of greenery in terms of its, I quote, social impact, measured quantitatively in its capacity to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, I end quote. This approach views greenness as material resource. A form of utilitarian environmentalism is conservationism, which advocates a kind of natural resource consumption that does not disable the carrying capacity of ecosystems. Typical examples of the second camp are those who believe that environmental and social degradation are firmly rooted in the system itself, not merely isolated abuses of the system. Therefore, meaningful change requires fundamental alteration of our society, our relationships, and our attitudes. When such ideology is translated into action, various degrees of radicalism can emerge. A milder variety is the authoritarian type of environmentalism, which calls for a strong governmental authority, a green leviathan, or totalitarian political state based on scientific knowledge. In order to avoid the tragedy of the commons, which is often inseparable from greenery, the biologist Garrett Hardin advocates authoritarian ecological measures. Such measures are necessary because pastures and water bodies, which are all part of the environment, will be exploited mindlessly for short-term gains without a proper watchdog mechanism. Greenness and the commons are a state of nature requiring government. Even the water bodies and the atmosphere, which are distinct forms of common resource pools that cannot be fenced in, need to be empowered. An extreme form of environmental authoritarianism is eco-fascism, which uses environmentalism as a plank for nationalism and the rejection of multiculturalism. It advocates racial cleansing for the sake of healthy environment. For example, I quote, Nazism defended an ideal of nationhood based on agrarianism and the natural superiority of the Aryan people. I end quote. Akin to eco-fascism is eco-terrorism, which deploys violence to guard greenness by countering the efforts of loggers and miners. From what I've said about greenness so far, it's evident that even when greenness is an attitude of either the reformist or the radical, the end or the goal of the attitude is always environment. It is for the sake of the environment that a reformer tries to solve environmental problems, and the radical attempts to change the social structure, which is the ultimate cause, he believes, of the environmental problems. But it's also possible to see greenness quite differently from how either the reformists or the radicals have. Sometimes greenness is not an object. It is neither environment, nor agriculture, nor vegetation, nor a type of attitude or thought. I dwelt on the idea of greenness so far, not with a view to understanding what it is in itself, but in order to see how the verbal form of green, namely greening, transgresses the meanings I've considered so far. A striking example of greening appeared in a leading national daily newspaper in 2007. It was titled Greening a Village, a report on the tree planting efforts of one Mr. A.S. Velusamy, a retired headmaster of a village known as Chelakkarichal near Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu. From a journalist's point of view, this may be a mere environmental project, but the following excerpt from the report shows that Velusamy's relation to the tree was not environmental at all. The reporter said, I quote him, young saplings are spoken to in encouragement, and a tree that has burst forth with flowers is patted affectionately. Only when he sees a wilting tree is Velusamy shaken. I end the quote. Velusamy is supposed to have asked the journalist, will you not feel bad if your young one is ready to leave the world? And he added, trees love human contact. When you look fondly at a tree, it nods. When you touch it, it is thrilled. What can get more satisfying? I end the quote. In this narrative that I shared with you, the word green might refer to the tree, but the transitive verbal form greening is not just about trees. It's about a kind of relationship between Mr. Velusamy and the trees. But what kind of relationship? He speaks to the tree, looks at her fondly, touches and pats her, and he's shaken. Feels bad when she's about to die. On her part, the tree loves being touched and spoken to, thrilled in his presence, and nods. The relationship is not one-sided. It is mutual. Now, how do we describe this relationship? The tree is certainly not an object manipulated by Velusamy. His attitude is neither that of a reformist nor a radical, because to both, the tree is part of the environment, whereas to Velusamy, the tree that greens his village is another agent like himself, an agent the philosopher Martin Buber would call a thou. In his 1923 book, Ich und Du, translated into English, I and Thou, Buber postulated two fundamental kinds of possible relationship between oneself and the world. Let me quote him rather than paraphrase his poetic prose, which was completely overwhelming when I first read him in the 1970s. Here he speaks. I consider a tree. I can look on it as a picture. Stiff column in a shock of light, or splash of green shot with delicate blue and silver of the background. I can perceive it as movement, flowing veins on clinging, pressing pith, suck of the roots, breathing of the leaves, ceaseless commerce with earth and air, and the obscure growth itself. I can classify it in a species and study it as a type in its structure and mode of life. I can subdue its actual presence and form so sternly that I recognize it only as an expression of law, of the laws in accordance with which a constant opposition of forces is continually adjusted, or of those in accordance with which the component substances mingle and separate. I can dissipate it and perpetuate it in number, in pure numerical relation. In all this, the tree remains my object, occupies space and time, and has its nature and constitution. It can also, however, come about if I have both will and grace, that in considering the tree, I become bound up in relation to it. The tree is now no longer it. I have been seized by the power of exclusiveness. To effect this, it is not necessary for me to give up any of the ways in which I consider the tree. There is nothing from which I would have to turn my eyes away in order to see, and no knowledge that I would have to forget. Rather, is everything picture and movement, species and type, law and number, indivisibly united in this event. Everything belonging to the tree is in this. Its form and structure, its colors and chemical composition, its intercourse with the elements and with the stars are all present in a single whole. The tree is no impression, no play of my imagination, no value depending on my mood, but it is bodied over against me and has to do with me as I with it, only in a different way. Let no attempt be made to sap the strength from the meaning of the relation. Relation is mutual. Will the tree have a consciousness then similar to our own? Oh, of that I have no experience. But do you wish, through seeming to succeed in it with yourself, once again to disintegrate that which cannot be disintegrated? I encounter no soul or dryad of the tree, but the tree itself. I end that long quotation. I hope you'll bear with me for that long quote, but I'm sure you enjoyed it. Interestingly, the encounter Buber describes is between him and a tree. If it is an encounter, does the tree possess consciousness? About that, he is uncertain. Nor can he vouch for a soul. Is she a spirit being? Not really. Probably under the influence of Christian theology, to Buber, the human and the tree are not equals. But in the case of Velusamy, he has no doubt that the tree is an agent very much like him, has feeling and responds to a human. As the tree is not a human, I may not call the tree a person, but the tree is certainly a persona. If so, the relationship between Velusamy and the tree is an interpersonaic one, and greening to him is nurturing such relationship. I'd like to draw your attention to Velusamy's question when he finds a wilting tree. His question is, will you not feel bad if your young one is ready to leave the world? If the tree is your young one, your child, she is a member of your family. Though Velusamy lives in an industrialist society built on the graveyard of Thinai society, his relationship to the tree is the characteristic relationship of Thinai. His idea of greening his village is nothing but the restoring of that kin relation among the members of the Thinai home. The kin relation has to be restored because the state society and the industrialist societies have degraded or destroyed that relationship. To us, greenness is an object, an environment, because our scientific worldview legitimizes such a view. Such a view has made possible industrialism itself, which has ushered in the Anthropocene, fouled our relationship with other members of our broken home, and also warped our literary imagination. Our imagination is not green anymore because it cannot restore the original primordial kin relation among members of the Thinai home. Green imagination works more like a food coupon. A certain kind of coupon is food coupon, not because the coupon itself is food, but because the coupon helps get food. To change the metaphor, greenness is the fruit of the tree of imagination. Effectively, green imagination is not a kind of imagination that's green, but such because it greens what it imagines. So greenness is not an object, as in the case of our idea of environment, but praxis, a process. Probably, we should speak of greening rather than greenness as such. If so, the effective question will be, what is greening? Greening, shall I say, is restoring the greenness to the degreened world. Restoring greenness is Thinai or homing, as I've called in an earlier essay titled, Is Homing Spiritual Praxis? So it is homing which removes all impediments that prevents the world from being the Thinai that it is meant to be. Being Thinai is being a home in which all members are united in a harmonious relationship. The members of the Thinai home are like the members of a body. Each member is what she or he is only in proper relation to the other. Therefore, a human member is human only when she or he stands in proper relation to the other members of the home. And a being other than human, such as the tree, is a tree only when she is akin to the humans with whom the tree stands in such relationship. When a human member arrogates to herself the right to manipulate or degrade or destroy other humans and beings other than humans of our home, the relation among the members of the home is either disrupted or destroyed, and it is not green anymore. Such a disruptive, destructive relationship characterizes our own industrialist society because the scientific attitude which has made possible this society has invalidated the primordial kin relation among the Thinai members. We cannot regard a tree as our kin anymore the moment we regard her from a modern scientific perspective, which requires us to objectify the tree and reduce it to its smallest atoms and molecules. When the tree is only an object which can be manipulated by the scientific desire, she loses her inviolable right to be a persona who ought to be loved, respected, and treated with dignity, very much like how we ourselves would expect to be treated by others in our own homes. The industrialist society is impossible without the scientific attitude I described a while ago. And as I'm trying to impress upon you, it's a kind of relation, a disharmonious one among the members of our home. And this is the most urgent problem we have to address, in my opinion. Today, we are all part of this destructive society, and we live in the Anthropocene either enjoying or enduring a highly compromised life. If you're enjoying it, probably I'm not with you. Many of our lives depend upon the objects, such as the computer and the mobile phone produced by this society. A personal rejection of industrialist objects, if it is possible at all, is not enough. We need to work towards a society which is based on a harmonious relation among the members of our home. When that goal is achieved, we will see the end of the Anthropocene, and beings other than humans will not be mere environment or objects anymore. Now, how does the literary imagination, if I may qualify that further as responsible literary imagination, represent the industrial society or industrialism? Here is a verse the contemporary Tamil writer Erode Tamilanban wrote when he visited the library of the University of Texas at Austin in the USA in 1996. His verse is titled, Austin Nulagamum Purananuttu Thayum. இன்னும் இருக்கிறது எனக்குள் டெக்சாஸ் வெயில். இன்னும் இருக்கிறது எனக்குள் நாசா ஏவுகணைகள் சீறி விண்ணில் கிளம்பும் தருணங்கள். எனினும் என்னையே பக்கம் பக்கமாய் புரட்டிக் கொண்டிருக்கிறது ஆஸ்டின் பல்கலைக்கழக நூலகம். புத்தக காதலன் பொள்ளாச்சி கணேசன் கணினி வலைக்குள் போய் என்னை பிடித்து வந்தபோது எனக்குள் பிடிபட்டது எவ்வளவு மகிழ்ச்சி. ஆள் நான் அம்பை அனுப்பினேன். புறநானூற்று தாய் புறப்பட்டு வந்தாள். எதற்கு என்னை அழைத்தாய் என்றாள். கணினி வாழ்வு பிடித்திருக்கிறதா கேட்டேன். எத்தனை ஆண்டுகள் பனை ஓலையில் படுத்திருந்தேன். எத்தனை ஆண்டுகள் கால்கள் கடுக்க நின்றிருந்தேன் காகித வீதிகளில். பாதுகாப்பான கணினி வீட்டில் பத்திரமாக இருக்கிறேன். தட்டினால் போதும், சட்டென்று கதவு திறந்து வர காத்திருக்கிறேன் என்றவள் இதழ்களில் விஞ்ஞானம் போட்டிருந்தது மெல்லிய புன்னகை கோடு. 300 பூமலரும் 3 அடி பொய்கை ஹைக்குவுக்காக என் விரல் பட்டதும் எடுத்து கொடுத்தது 300 நூல்களை. இந்த வாமன வாகனமேறி வையகத்தை எப்போது வலம் வருவார்கள் என் தமிழ் மக்கள்? கெட்டையபுரத்தானை கூப்பிட்டு கேட்டேன். விசுவரூபங்களை தியானிக்கும் போது என்று சொன்னான். விருட்டென்று எழுந்தேன். That's his verse. And here is my translation of this piece into English for the benefit of all those who don't follow English, follow Tamil. Austin Library and the mother of Purananuru. Even now within me burns the Texas sun. Even now within me remain those moments when skyward NASA rockets roar and soar. But still, does the library of Austin University turn me page after page. When the book lover Pollachi Ganesan into the computer net went, held me and brought me, within me was caught. What great joy. I, the person, sent the arrow, and out came the mother of Purananuru asking, why did you call me? Do you like computer life? I queried. For how many years have I been lying down on Palmyra leaves? For how many years have I been standing with aching feet in paper streets? In secure computer home, safe am I. A single tap will do. Ready am I to come out, opening the door in a jiffy, said she, on whose lips had signs sketched lines of a soft smile. For the 3-line haiku tank, in which blooms 300 flowers, when my fingers touched it, it took out and gave me 300 volumes. Boarding this dwarf vehicle, when will my Tamil people go around the world? I asked the bard of Ettayapuram. When they contemplate the cosmic forms, he answered. Briskly, I got up. So that's the translation. There are so many things about this piece that cry out for critical attention, but I will confine my discussion to just only one aspect. The industrialist utopia the verse envisages and seeks to promote fervently. Consider the question, when will my Tamil people go around the world boarding this dwarf vehicle? Of course, he refers to the computer. To the speaker persona, the computer is a Vamana Vahanam, a dwarf vehicle which could transport the Tamil people to distant lands. Quite ironically, the computer transported the Tamil poet only to his own land, the land of the mother of Purananuru, rather than distant parts of the world. However, there is no doubt that the real agenda of the speaker persona is the promotion of an industrialist utopia. Strangely, the Purananuru mother also endorses destructive industrialism by rejecting her Tinai home, which in her opinion is not secure and safe enough, like the digital computer home provided by the computer, the highest achievement of industrialism. Rejection of the Tinai home means rejection of the kin relation the mother has with her family and her ancestral home, which is rooted in a definite place-time, or what Tolkapiam would call mudal. A digitalized home, if at all it is a home, is one without mudal. As I have shown elsewhere, mudal or place-time is transcendental and immanent at the same time, and in this respect, it is sacred or divine. Therefore, recovering the mother's place-time-based local home is in a way resacralizing her home. But the sacred is not amenable to modern science, and sacralization is actually anti-scientific praxis. Nevertheless, the verse says that modern science has brought a smile on the lips of the digitized mother of Purananuru, suggesting the mother's approval of the scientific reduction of her psychosomatic and communitarian being to a digital being. Such reduction was possible only in an industrialist society. Therefore, recovering her psychosomatic and communitarian being she had always enjoyed in a Tinai home amounts to emancipating her from the clutches of industrialism. In the celebration of industrialism, the verse Austin Nulagamam, which I just now shared with you, is not alone. It has its companions, predecessors, who have imagined such utopias. The historical context may vary, but the basic nature of industrialism does not. The anarchic relation on which industrialism is based continues to define it even today. Consider the following sample lines of the song Paradadesam of Subramania Bharati, written in 1919, which I will translate into English as we go. Paradadesam என்று பெயர் சொல்லுவார், மிடி பயம் கொல்லுவார், துயர் பகை வெல்லுவார். Translated, it would read, they who call it part of the nation slay the dread of poverty, win over foe and sorrow. Now that's the Pallavi or the initial couplet. Here are some charanangal or stanzas. வெள்ளிப்பனிமலையின் மீதுலாவுவோம், அதிமேலை கடல் முழுதும் கப்பல் விடுவோம், பள்ளித்தலமனைத்தும் கோயில் செய்குவோம், எங்கள் பாரத தேசம் என்று தோள் கொட்டுவோம். Translated, we shall over the snow-clad mountains stroll, across the whole Western Ocean's ships sail, make all Pali shrines temples, and celebrate our part of the nation, thumping our shoulders proudly. The third stanza, வெட்டுக்கனிகள் செய்து தங்கம் முதலாம் வேறுபல பொருளும் குடைந்தெடுப்போம். 8 திசைகளிலும் சென்றிவை விற்றே எண்ணும் பொருள் அனைத்தும் கொண்டு வருவோம். And my translation of that will be, we shall mine minerals, gold and many other things, travel in all 8 directions and sell these and bring back all the things we'd like to have. Here is his 7th stanza. காசி நகர் புலவர் பேசும் முறைதான் காஞ்சியில் கேட்பதற்கோர் கருவி செய்வோம். ராஜபுத்தானத்து வீரர் தமக்கு நல்லியல் கன்னடத்து தங்கமளிப்போம். In my translation, make a device to hear in Kanji the discourses of the poets of Kasi town, and we shall to the heroes of Rajput gift refined gold from Karnataka. His 8th, just 2 lines from this 8th. பட்டினில் ஆடையும் பஞ்சில் உடையும் பண்ணி மலைகளென வீதி குவிப்போம். In my translation, make dresses from silk and garments from cotton and keep them like mountains in the streets. His 9th, ஆயுதம் செய்வோம் நல்ல காகிதம் செய்வோம் ஆலைகள் வைப்போம் கல்வி சாலைகள் வைப்போம் ஓயுதல் செய்யோம் தலை சாயுதல் செய்யோம் உண்மைகள் சொல்வோம் பல வன்மைகள் செய்வோம். And my translation, we will make weapons, good paper, build factories and schools. We shall not cease, nor shall we not drowsily speak the truth and make great things. And here is the last, and it is the 11th. மந்திரம் கற்போம் வினை தந்திரம் கற்போம் வானை அழப்போம் கடல் மீனை அழப்போம் சந்திர மண்டலத்தியல் கண்டு தெளிவோம் சந்திதரு பெருக்கும் சாத்திரம் கற்போம். And the translation, we shall learn magic and many techniques, scan the skies and the fishes of the sea, exploring the moon, we shall know it well and learn the science of cleaning up alleys and streets. Bharati wrote it in 1919. We may recall that several modern scientific inventions have already seen the light of day during Bharati's lifetime. Some of the important ones you would have known probably were the first automobile, which was made in 1886, the first airship Zeppelin in 1900, the radio and vacuum cleaner in 1901, the air conditioner in 1902, the first manned airplane of Wright brothers in 1903, the first helicopter in 1907, the first talking motion picture in 1910, and several others. It's no surprise that he dreamt of innovative and enterprising Indians who would take full advantage of industrialism and gave poetic expression to this waking dream. When he wrote in 1919 that Indians should, I quote, my own translation, make a device to hear in Kanchi the discourses of the poets of Kasi town, either he knew already about the invention of the radio in 1901 and wished that Indians would make good use of it for efficient circulation of knowledge, or he was not aware of it at all, therefore thought that he was writing poetic science fiction. However, as the radio was already invented, what Bharatiya wrote in 1919 cannot be regarded as a sample of poetic science fiction. Secondly, he seems to be an ardent advocate of mass production. Mark his words, make dresses from silk and garments from cotton and heap them like mountains in the streets. Similarly, he wanted the oceans of the Northern Hemisphere to be filled with Indian ships. And he also seems to have promoted mining. Listen to the lines. We shall mine minerals, gold and many other things, travel in all 8 directions and sell these, and bring back all the things we'd like to have. At least in these lines, Bharati's nationalism is more an economic one rather than an ethical one. He wanted the country to invest in mining in order to accumulate more wealth. The products made from the raw material that was mined could be sold all over the world to make India more wealthy. Evidently, Bharati's song is a vigorous advertisement for industrialism, which commenced in 1760 with the Industrial Revolution. but we know that it has been critiqued by poets right from its inception. When Robert Burns saw fire and smoke in 1787 from Carron Iron Works in Scotland, his speaker persona sang in his poem at Carron Iron Works, which Burns wrote in 1784. I'll give you his Scottish in standard English. We came not here to view your works in hopes to be more wise, but only lest we go to hell, it may be no surprise. But when we knocked at your door, the porter could not permit us. So may, should we to hell's gates come, your fellow Satan serve us. In 1789, William Blake lamented the condition of child labor on which industrialism thrived in his well-known poem, Chimney Sweeper. Here's the first stanza. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. In the early 19th century, the Luddites protested against industrialism, and they were outlawed in Britain. Defending their Luddites, Lord Byron insisted in 1812, in his maiden speech in the House of Lords, that the Luddites were, I quote, only reacting due to circumstances of the most unparalleled distress, I end quote. Had Byron lived to witness the First World War, which relied greatly on industrialism, his anxiety over modern technology would have only doubled. The large scale and faster production of war machinery, including weapons, chemicals, aircraft, clothing, and the construction of infrastructures like railways, ports, bridges for housing and mobility of people, were all possible only due to industrialization. Even after witnessing the worst ever large-scale destruction caused by the First World War, Subramania Bharatiyar glorified industrialization in his song he wrote a year after the war. 18 years after Bharatiyar passed away, W.H. Auden moved to the United States from England, and he was persuaded to respond to the American variety of industrialism with his well-known piece, To the Unknown Citizen. His persona makes it clear that the industrialist utopia will offer all conveniences of modern life only for a price. That price is loss of freedom and happiness. And you know this poem very well, so probably I'll skip reading that poem. Now, Auden's poem does not mention computer because it became a commercial product only in the 1980s, more than 40 years after the publication of the poem. Had it become a modern convenience in the 30s, we could have reasonably expected it to have found mention in this verse. But simply because it was not mentioned, it does not mean that what applies to the other conveniences do not to the computer, which is also a product of industrialism. Now, what is significant about Auden's verse is that it is a satire on the modern scientific method, which reduces a human to statistical quantities, which are unfortunately inadequate to deal with values like happiness and freedom. And as I had mentioned earlier, it is this method which validates and makes possible the modern conveniences, products of industrialism, which the unknown citizen could not reject in his personal life. A statistical approach to happiness was first suggested by the Bhutanese king Wangchuck some 30 years after Auden wrote The Unknown Citizen. In 1972, the king expressed the view that gross national happiness was more important than gross domestic product. And in 2008, Bhutan developed the Gross National Happiness Index. And in 2011, attempted a survey of happiness of its people. In 2012, the United Nations placed happiness on the global agenda and encouraged what is today called the science of happiness. Since then, every year, experts of the science are bringing out an annual report on the happiness of the people of different countries of the world. The World Happiness Report of 2022 measures the level of happiness of 147 countries of the world. If Finland is in the first place in the ranking, India is in the 136th of the 147. The report uses 3 indicators of subjective well-being: life evaluation, positive effects, and negative effects. Life evaluations are done with the help of a statistic tool called Cantrell's ladder, of which the lowest rung scores 0 and the highest 10. Each respondent provides a numerical response to each of the 6 indicators under life evaluation. Positive and negative effects are measured by an average of individual yes or no answers to 3 questions about emotions experienced or not on the previous day. Now, let me give you a few sample findings of this report. 1, this report is able to say which is the happiest country and which is the unhappiest. And 10 reports have come out so far. The global average of positive emotions was 0.66 last year, because the average respondent experienced 2 of the 3 positive emotions the previous day, that person has had the previous day, compared to the global average of 0.29 for negative emotions. Now, this is according to the 2021 report. And according to 2012 reports, happier countries tend to be richer countries. And according to the same report, happiness is lowest in middle age. Now, one of the findings here is that happier countries tend to be rich countries. Now, what do we infer from this? Except the idea that you have to be rich in order to be happy. Now, such an idea neither conforms to the teachings of spiritual leaders who taught people the opposite idea, namely the incompatibility of happiness and wealth, nor to the point made by Auden's poem under discussion. If this is the finding of the science of happiness, I, for one, would not rely on it. I would even go to the extent of saying that happiness is not amenable to the scientific method, which is also the burden of the poem, The Unknown Citizen of W.H. Auden. Happiness is not the explicit theme of Subramania Bharatiya's song we discussed, but as it projects the nationalist utopia in relation to wealth, and as all utopias are supposed to bring happiness to the people who will inhabit it, we might presume that Bharati's will also make the people of his utopia happy. But the question is, will it? Bharati's song makes no attempt to problematize industrialism, which alone, in the view of the poet, could make Bharatam the utopia he dreams of. If not happiness, at least pleasure is certainly part of the utopian agenda of the poem, Austin Nulagamum Purananu Tutayum. While the computer user derives pleasure from surfing the internet, the virtual Tamil mother who emerges on the computer screen seems to be pleased with modern science. The utopian information society seems to be quite a pleasurable one. But the seamy side of the society is not within the view of the reader at all. The poet probably assumes that such a society should, by all means, guarantee the well-being of the Tamil people. The industrialist utopian verses we considered so far are undoubtedly products of creative imagination. But these verses also show that the greenness of imagination we are trying to imagine now does not depend on either the intensity of the imagination or the fame of the authors who imagine. Rather, it does on the greening potential of the composition. Phrased as a question we might want to ask, to what extent does the literary imagination of a composition contribute to either the problematization or the mending of the broken home? The Anthropocene and the great acceleration after the world wars and all the critiques of industrialism that have emerged so far transport us to the Tinai home we long for, not only because industrialism and the computer are not green enough, but also because the literary imagination that made possible the author's composition is not green enough. Literary imagination is green enough only when it mends the broken Tinai. Mending the broken Tinai involves, as I had already pointed out, re-sacralization of the industrialized home, which is invisible but present in Bharatadesam of Bharati and digitized in Austin Nulagamam of Erode Tamilanban. Re-sacralization is a vital aspect of greening our day-greened world. A stanza in Watson Solomon's poem, Corona Quarantine, exhorts re-sacralization quite compellingly. Here are the relevant lines I would like to quote from his stanza. The broken oikos must become a fame, and nature will heal herself by and by. With imagination and poetic skill, our thoughts must towards divinity tend. If I were to imagine a re-sacralized and truly green Tinai home for the mother of Purananuru, how would that home be? I would like to share with you my composition, which I composed just a month ago, titled Purananu Thai, which could be read, I think, as a counterpoint companion piece to the verse Austin Nulagamam Purananu Thayum. In my song, the speaker persona and the mother of Purananuru show how the digital home offered to the Purananuru mother is only a semiotic one and not the real one, and how the Tinai home alone has always been the happiest for her. I crave your indulgence to consider this song as the epilogue of my presentation. And here is my song. Purananu Thai. Purananu Thai Yandullal Uravu Uruperum Natun Chitil Puratulala Agatullala Kuramagal Vadivadu Kurinji Kudilo Uruvillada Paravelidano ஏட்டில் என்றும் இருந்திலேன் தாளில் என்றும் நின்றிலேன் எண்ணமாய் கணினி வீட்டிலும் குடிநான் ஏறிலேன் வந்திலேன் வையத்தை வலமாய் வாமன ஊர்தியில் என் தமிழ் மக்கள் என்றும் பரவழி ஏறுதல் வேண்டேன் எட்டயபுரத்தான் எவர்க்கு பணித்த விசுவரூப தியானமும் வேண்டேன் எங்குளன் நானென வினவுதியாயின் நினக்கிதி கூறுவன் நிலம் பொழுது முதலாம் திணைக்கள சிற்றிலுள் இல்லறம் ஈயும் இன்பம் கண்டு நல்லறம் கூற ஊரவை ஏறும் தீரமும் நெஞ்சில் ஈரமும் நிறைந்த வல்லனத்தாயர் இன்றும் உளரே எண்ணமாய் மனத்தில் எழுந்து மறைபவரோ எண்ணாய் ஒளிர்ந்து அணைந்திடுவரோ கணினியில் அவரே திண்ணிய உள்ளமும் மெய்யும் உடையோர் தோன்றுவர் அகத்திலும் புறத்திலும் என்றும் இவ்வுண்மையைக் கண்டு உணர்ந்திடுமையே. My own translation of my own poem is this. Where lives the mother of Purananuru? Is she outside or inside the firm-pillared small house where kinship forms? Where does the hill woman dwell? In Kurinji hut or in formless outer space? Never have I dwelt in text, nor in paper, nor in a computer home digitally, nor in that dwarf device gone around the world. Never will I, my Tamil people, want to ascend into the cosmic space, nor will I for them want meditation the Eteburam man advocated. If you ask where I dwell to you this I will tell. In the small house in Chennai stage, on place time-based, able and noble mothers there are even now that find happiness in home and with a heart valorous and loving ascend the assembly to justice defend. Are they the ones that in the mind as thought appear and disappear? Are they the ones that glow and die as light in a computer? Strong mind and body they have. They arise inside and outside the home. See this reality and realize the truth. Thank you very much for your patient listening. Hello. 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 So do we have questions? Hello. Am I audible?
You are, Prof. You are.
Do we
So
have
yes,
questions?
you're audible now. There was a technical problem.
So were you able to listen to everything, or
Only the last part of your session, sir.
the last
Couple of
part you were not able
last-
to hear?
Yeah, the last 2 minutes, a couple of last sentences we were not able to hear. Otherwise, we listened to the everything you said.
Okay. Were you able to hear the song that I shared with you at the end, or do you want me to share that with you again?
Yes,
Um,
the one that you have composed,
yeah,
we got it. We got it. Sir.
you,
Maybe
you
last-
were able to hear it?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay, the translation also?
Yes, very much.
Okay, good. Okay, then that's it. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your deliberations upon the importance of imagination through revisiting greenness. You insisted on the multivalence of greenness, and it was very appreciable. Thank you, sir. You introduced us to eco-fascism and eco-terrorism, and you made an analogy between green imagination and a food coupon, very interestingly, insisting that they are both alike, they work similarly, not as an object, but as a practice or a process. You threw light on restoring greenness or homing, which is Thinaidal, and by recounting ideas through Tamil verses, you made it thoroughly enjoyable, sir. Thank you. And you answered the central question you posed during the beginning of the talk: when is the literary imagination green enough? By reiterating that literary imagination is green enough when it mends the thinai through re-sacralization. Thank you, sir, for opening our eyes to such a pressing question. Thank you for your time and presence, sir. There
You're
are some
welcome.
questions that have been posted here.
Sure. Yeah. You want to read them out? Yeah. Does someone wants to read out the question?
So I will start with one question, which says, can you elaborate on eco-terrorism? Eco-terrorism.
Well, as I was telling you, it's a form of green radicalism, as I was telling you. And if you had listened to the presentation carefully, you would have noticed that both reformism and radicalism won't do, for me at least, because both of them are based on the idea of environment. And beings other than human, to me, do not constitute an environment. I would never call them an environment. So, well, I hope that gives you some ideas to what my view is about all of these different forms of radicalism, whether it is eco-fascism or eco-terrorism or eco-totalitarianism, whatever it is.
Thank you, sir. We're moving
You're
to the
welcome.
next. Sir, I hope I'm audible.
Shall we go
now.
on to the next question?
Yeah, we are moving
Yeah,
on. to
you
the
are.
next question.
Yeah.
What is the
Yes.
importance of inclusiveness in greening? How inclusive is Aldo Leopold and John Muir's idea of conservation? How do you see the recent criticism on their environmental view as racist or white supremacist?
Mhm. Well, greenness, well, when I talk about, I mean, my idea of greening is certainly inclusive, and you probably would have noticed that because the Tine home includes not just humans, but also all beings other than humans. So, I mean, we are talking beyond the stratified human society, the discriminating human society. We are moving beyond that and including, even other creatures, beings other than humans. So that way, this idea of greening, or Tine, as I put it, is definitely inclusive and probably as inclusive as anything, I mean, as it possibly could be. I mean, you can't be more inclusive than this. But saying that, having said that, I should also, I mean, probably comment on this idea of the race question. Yeah, in the very beginning itself, when eco-criticism reader came out, Glotfelty herself, said in her introduction that only texts from the United States were part of that reader, and we needed to bring out other texts which were more inclusive, which included texts from other parts of the world. And such texts have come now, but there is, of course, always, there is this tendency for everyone to look up to the West for anything academic, anything that is, shall we say, legitimate within the academia. So if it is eco-criticism, it's something that has to be, that is kind of endorsed by the Western world, particularly the United States, So that, if I put it this way, it's a kind of a colonial mentality. I mean, we need to decolonize, eco-criticism that way. We need to, look at all of these different, responses, in this field with the kind of diversity that these perspectives and theories demand and expect. That's something that has not yet been realized, but I wish, we reached that, shall we say, that point of diversity, that desirable point of diversity and breadth of, attitude that's required. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. There is one more question, the last question. Does green studies, taking into account the multivalence of it, address issues of marine ecology? Or just limit itself to landscapes?
Well, that's an interesting question. Now, probably, my answer was already there in the previous answer that I gave you. As I said, Tine is not just about humans, it's also about all the other beings. And when you say all the other beings of the land and of the water and also the air, in all the elements. So most certainly it would include oceanic beings also. In the Tamil Tine theory, Neidal is the Tine of the sea coast, as you very well know. Of course, it's the coast, but then the ocean is an important part of the sea coast, the coastal ecosystem that we talk about in Neidal Tine. So definitely marine ecology as well as geological, land ecology, atmospheric ecology, all varieties of ecology should be, shall we say, grist to the eco-criticism mill. If only you have the right conceptual tools to handle that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, this is Shanti.
Yeah. Hello.
So thank you so much.
You're
On
welcome.
behalf of the department, I express my sincere gratitude, sir, for being with us and for your very insightful lecture. I know it's past midnight to you.
Yes, it
In
is.
spite of that, you're able to make it out and be with us. And sir, we are very grateful to you for that. Thank you, sir, for just going beyond the imagination and making us realize that our venture should be more serious to make our endeavors green. And having introduced green cultural studies, connecting the attitude more with our thinking pattern. And moreover, sir, thank you for highlighting the fact that every little aspect in this universe has its own intrinsic worth in all life forms, and the kind of cohabiting feeling which we need to nurture as we proceed further. And we could understand the kind of ontological interconnections you were able to make and the metaphysical wholeness you were trying to talk about to build the human and the non-human well. And the world, sir, has always remained very polarized and indifferent towards the physical environment, especially your reference to the trees made me think about a lot of literary annotations and the references, starting with Wordsworth's Borrowdale references, where he talks about trees, or Torudats or Casuarina tree, or probably even Love begins his essay by telling Norman Maclean's stories were rejected by the publishers because his stories had trees in them. And trees were the most targeted entities in the physical landscape. Trees were felled for the sake of culture, the civilization, and because of man's greed. You were able to bring in a beautiful relation as to how we need to look at trees, or how our attitude has to change with respect to looking at the universe. And we are really grateful to you, sir, and for all the translations, the beautiful translations which we were able to get. Your own translations, they were so enlightening. Thank you for spending your very valuable time. We value your presence very much. And thank you for being so generous, for having accepted to be with us in spite of being very late there. And thank you, sir.
You're most welcome. And I would like to, thank you for emphasizing the rejection, neglect, and even, if I should say, subjugation of trees, how humans have systematically dismissed, rejected, subjugated the trees. That's a very interesting point for all of these researchers and students who are sitting there in the hall with you to take home. That's a take-home idea, I think. Wonderful idea to take home.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Thank you so much.
always we have been polarized in this aspect. On the one
Mhm.
side, we emphasize from the literature that nature is very important. But on the other side, in the name of civilizations, trees have always been felt. So trees are the greatest, what do you call, the non-human entities we target very much.
Mhm. Yeah.
And we don't appreciate. So thank you very much for your wonderful lecture, sir. We are able to get a take-home message from your lecture. Thank you for the wonderful translations also. They were so meaningful.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Hopefully we will see you in the next lecture, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. We will.
Students, before you disperse, the QR code has been posted. You can scan that and provide your feedback for both the sessions. And also paper presenters, those who have joined online and offline paper presenters, there is an information for you. The post-lunch session for paper presentation and parallel sessions begins at 2:30 sharp.